Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Tuesday the 22nd of October here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, bonds are selling off everywhere as traders trim their expectations for Federal Reserve rate cuts.
Russia hosts its biggest gathering of global leaders since it invaded Ukraine.
Plus, from a Gen Z-focused financial chatbot to carbon fibre vehicle parts, Bloomberg's top 25 UK startups to watch.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Bonds are selling off around the world as investors look again at a robust US economy and whether Federal Reserve rate cut expectations are overdone. The 10-year Treasury yield jumped 11 basis points to 4.2% on Monday as expectations of an increased Fed hold in November and the likelihood of a Trump election victory grew. Add to that cautious Fed officials like Minneapolis Fed President Neil Kashkari. He says he favours reducing interest rates at a slower pace in the coming quarters.
Right now, I've forecasted some more modest cuts over the next several quarters to get to something around neutral, but it's going to depend on the data.
After Kashkari's comments, overnight indexed swaps suggest a 25 basis point Fed cut next month is no longer certain. Some traders are also pointing to the IMF's warnings of a $100 trillion debt problem, saying it's driven concerns about debt supply.
HSBC is to merge two of its largest businesses outside the UK and Hong Kong as part of a regional restructure of the bank. It will combine its global commercial and investment banking operations, as well as creating a new international wealth and premier banking business. The changes are part of new CEO Georges Elhedery's plan to rein in costs. HSBC also announced the appointment of Pam Kaur as Chief Financial Officer.
President Vladimir Putin is hosting Russia's biggest gathering of world leaders since the invasion of Ukraine. The leaders of 32 countries, including India, China and South Africa, will be at the BRICS summit after membership of the group expanded. For Putin, the event is a chance to show the US and its allies that he's no pariah. In the business part of the summit last week, he compared the BRICS growth to the G7 countries.
In the last 10 years, more than 40% of the growth of global GDP of the entire world economics came from the BRIC states. According to the results for the current year, the average rate of economic growth in BRICS is projected at 4%. This is higher than the rates in the G7 countries. There it is only 1.7%, and higher than the global rates. The global rates will be 3.2%.
Vladimir Putin's comments through a translator there come as China is on track to become the largest market for Russia's pipeline gas this year, overtaking Europe.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken arrives in the Middle East for his 11th trip since the October 7th attack. America's top diplomat has been trying to engineer a ceasefire between Israel and Iran-backed militants since the attack on Israel more than a year ago. Bloomberg's Paul Wallace says this round of talks, though, is unlikely to change that.
Israel at the moment sees itself as on the front foot and degrading Hamas and Hezbollah to a massive degree, and it thinks that these military gains that it's been making in the last several weeks, if not few months, are very much in its favour when it comes to eventual diplomatic talks and eventual ceasefire negotiations.
Bloomberg's Paul Wallace adds that Blinken's visit comes as Israel's retaliation against Iran is still yet to come. The US maintains that Israel's killing of the Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar last week may open the way for a breakthrough, even though Hamas leaders and Netanyahu have both vowed to fight on.
China's wealth fund has issued a record $29 billion worth of bonds this year. Central Huijin Investment, a unit of the country's sovereign fund, has now sold the most notes annually since it first tapped the onshore credit market in 2010. Bloomberg understands the fresh issuance includes 9 billion yuan of 3-year debt securities and 15 billion yuan of 5-year bonds. The firm's bond offering documents say that sale proceeds will be used to optimise its debt structure and replenish working capital for other purposes approved by regulators.
Now to the UK, Thames Water's quest to raise equity has begun. The indebted utility provider needs a cash injection to stay afloat. Bloomberg's Tiwa Adebayo has more.
£3.3 billion is the figure Thames Water needs to avoid collapse. The UK's largest water and sewage operator started the process to raise those funds over the past week, granting investors access to sensitive information. Alongside its advisors from Rothschild, Thames have approached numerous sources of capital, including private equity shops Brookfield Asset Management and the Carlyle Group. With only enough money to sustain itself until next May, time is of the essence. But the firm is still awaiting a ruling from regulator Ofwat, which will determine the allowed return on equity for investors. The utility is seen as too big to fail, and without new funds, it will likely be nationalised temporarily. In London, Tiwa Adebayo, Bloomberg Radio.
In a moment, we're going to look at what hosting the BRICS summit means to Russia's President Vladimir Putin, plus bring you our reporting on why European central bankers are worried about Donald Trump winning the US election. But first, we also wanted to mention some fantastic reporting. Bloomberg's list of the top 25 startups to watch here in the UK. It's just been published this morning. What did you make of it?
Unsurprisingly, lots of AI mentioned in this list as well. Some of the names may be those that you've heard of before, like the autonomous driving company Wave, so they're on the list as well. A few others that I liked. There's one called Anna, which stands for Absolutely No Nonsense Admin. So it's an app to help small businesses do things like taxes or accounting. 10 minutes a week, they say that it takes for them to do that, and it does things all via their app as well. So that's one of the companies I picked out. There's also Her, which is an online fashion rental marketplace for luxury brands. And also I found this one really interesting as well. A company called Sibstar. It has a debit card and app for families living with dementia as a way to help those who are suffering from the illness to avoid being scammed, overspending or losing money. So some really interesting ideas in this list.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of AI. There's also lots of biotech and pharma type businesses, which are really quite interesting, getting, the latest medical advances to market more quickly, those sorts of things.
Perhaps
but yeah,
some
it's
of
fascinating.
That growth engine the Chancellor will be hoping for.
Absolutely, in the budget, of course.
As well.
Yeah. Let's focus, though, on the BRICS this morning. Russia is hosting its biggest gathering of world leaders since the invasion of Ukraine. It's happening about 450 miles east of Moscow. Now, the Russian president is keen to use this summit to show the US and its allies that he's not a pariah on the international stage. Our Russia economics and government editor Greg Sullivan joins us now for more on this. Greg, good morning. Who is due to attend this meeting? Are they all supporters of Putin?
Well, as you said, this is one of the biggest gatherings of world leaders since the invasion of Ukraine. There are leaders from 32 nations, which is obviously bigger than the BRICS group itself, and in others like UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who will be there. Leaders include India's Narendra Modi, China's Xi Jinping, but also Turkey's Recep Erdogan, whose country is eager to join BRICS, but not quite a member yet. The Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had to cancel at the last minute due to a head injury sustained at home, but it's still an impressive group. Those in attendance, they vary. Xi has been critical to propping up Russia economically and diplomatically amid the sanctions, but others have been more restrained, especially amid the war in Ukraine. So there's not everyone has been a vocal, outright supporter, but clearly some have been critical to propping up Russia.
How important is hosting a meeting of this size and with these important global figures to Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's definitely important. As you said, this is a chance for Putin to demonstrate that he's still a player on the international stage. And that's even as the U.S. and its allies have sought to isolate him diplomatically as punishment for the war. It also shows that Putin's message of reshaping the U.S.-led global order, that actually is resonating among some countries and clearly is attractive for others who are seeking to join BRICS. Even if some countries do insist that BRICS is not anti-Western, one, for instance, the UAE is a new member of the BRICS group, still maintains good ties with the U.S. But another aspect of this summit is that it's a chance for Putin to meet with other leaders and groups and one-on-one. And that's at a time when travel's complicated for him because of that international arrest warrant that's out for him from the ICC.
What are the key issues then on the agenda? I mean, the possibility also in the background of trying to challenge US dollar dominance.
There's several issues, and that is one of the main ones. Clearly, alternatives to the U.S. dollar are definitely on the agenda. Russia recently presented a long list of ideas for possible changes to cross-border payments. It's really been struggling with those amid the sanctions regime. The group as a whole does favor greater use of their national currencies in bilateral trade, but Russia's really in a unique situation, being heavily sanctioned and cut off from the financial system. Other members of BRICS are not. And so some of them do remain skeptical about the need to replace the dollar as the reserve currency. India, for one, rejects promoting China's yuan as an alternative to the dollar for reserves. Another key issue for BRICS beyond the currency will be further expansion. The group expanded to 6 additional nations last year, but some members oppose further expansion. So that's one of the divisions could be discussed at the meeting.
Are we likely to hear any discussion of the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
It's certainly going to be a topic that is hanging over this summit, as it always has. It's unclear whether Putin's going to bring it up or how he'll bring it up and discuss, but it will be there in the background and it will be on the minds of commentators and observers. It's clearly been an issue for Russia economically. It's really been with the sanctions that's made Russia have to realign and reorient itself towards countries like China, which will be in attendance at the BRICS meeting. So even if not directly discussed, it will always be there in the background, informing discussions and coloring the way that the summit proceeds.
Okay, Greg, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our Russia economics and government editor, Greg Sullivan, thank you for bringing us up to speed on the BRICS summit.
There are 2 weeks to go until the US presidential election, and central bankers in Europe, who were already worrying about slowing growth, now have another concern: how much damage Donald Trump could do if he returns to the White House. Policymakers fear his appetite for new trade wars threatens the region, whose position is far weaker than the last time that he was president. Our Euro area economy reporter Alex Weber has been writing about this, and he joins us now for more. Alex, good morning. How would another election win for Donald Trump impact European economies, and why are officials so worried?
Yeah, good morning. So there are lots of things for Europe to worry about, of course, like Donald Trump's security ideas. But for the most problematic idea for Europe, for the European economy, is the one about tariffs. So, Donald Trump has proposed to impose a 60% tariff on all goods from China and as much as 20% on everyone else. And if he gets elected, even the threat doesn't even have to be imposed, but even the threat and the uncertainty it creates would probably amount to a sizable hit for the European economy.
Why is the current moment economically so delicate when facing a threat like this?
Yeah, in short, it's because the economy is already doing quite badly. The recovery that officials have long predicted isn't really getting off the ground. Germany is probably headed for another annual contraction. France is preparing huge spending cuts and tax increases. Even last week, the ECB had to accelerate another rate cut because consumers are so hesitant. Investment is weak, and those are exactly the things that will probably get hit by the uncertainty created by another potential Trump win.
How does this situation compare to when Donald Trump was president the last time?
Yeah, when you think back to 2017, it really seems from another world. The war in Ukraine hadn't fully broken out. There was no pandemic. Inflation wasn't a concern. So the initial situation was much better for European economies. But even back then, you saw after 2 years that the global economy was heading for a slowdown. After Trump's tariffs that he introduced on some Chinese and European goods, such as steel and aluminum. And the IMF back then warned that trade tensions were a major reason behind the slowdown. So fast forward to now, you have a weaker starting position and possibly an even bigger impact because of the wide-ranging ideas on trade that Trump has.
What have central bankers said on this issue?
So for this piece, we spoke with the governor of the Swedish central bank, Elhedery, who warned that additional trade barriers obviously aren't great, especially for a country like Sweden that's really reliant on international trade. The president of the Bundesbank, Joachim Nagel, also recently warned of the adverse impact of any new tariffs. He was also concerned that it might spark another round of inflation, although the impact there is a bit less clear-cut. And we asked ECB President Christine Lagarde in a press conference last week, and she also sounded pretty concerned and said that it's clear downside risk for the economy. And we're probably going to hear more along these lines when officials meet in Washington this week for the International Monetary Fund's annual meetings.
Okay, and what sort of response could we expect from those central bankers or governments if there are negative impacts on the European economy?
So there's now a bit less fiscal space after the pandemic. Governments have simply more debt after dishing out so much aid to companies and households. So that probably means central bankers would once again be on the front line here. And the good thing is that interest rates are now a bit higher, so there's a bit more room to cut. But it would certainly... Central bankers would certainly prefer the sort of Goldilocks scenario that they had predicted, which was for a gradual recovery to take hold, inflation to come down, and that would allow gradual interest rate cuts. And another hit to the economy that's already weaker than predicted would probably throw all of that out of balance.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.